First, let's get to the macros. The U.S. Federal Reserve Chief Jerome Powell's final press conference did not rock the boat. But he and a majority of Fed policymakers erred a bit on the hawkish side given the lack of progress in the Gulf. So, at his swan song meeting as Fed boss, Powell once again carried an anti-Trump crescendo. The Fed held rates steady for the third consecutive meeting despite President Trump's repeated rhetoric for deep rate cuts. But the 8-4 vote at Wednesday's meeting was the most divided decision since October 1992.
We're in an unusually difficult situation. So we've really had 4 supply shocks. You can say more than 4, but at a minimum, we had the pandemic, we had the invasion of Ukraine, we had tariffs, and now we have Iran and the oil, the oil spike. So every supply shock has the capability of driving inflation up and unemployment up. And what do? The central bank has a really hard time knowing what to do. So the right thing to do is to try to balance the achievement of those 2 goals, and that's what our framework calls for us to do.
With Fed pick Kevin Warsh confirmed at a key Senate committee vote to become the next boss, Trump's desire for rate cuts could come true. However, Warsh faces a tough inflation environment to ease rates. 4 Fed policymakers dissented on the pause in an interest rate decision. That is the first time since 1992 when there have been so many policymakers voting against a common decision. The dissents went in opposite directions. Fed dove. Stephen Moran once again voted in favor of a 0.25% rate cut. On the other hand, Elizabeth Morgan Hammock, Neil Kashkari and Lori Logan objected to including easing bias in the statement. Lisa Cook, who was targeted by the Trump administration, aligned with the stance favored by Powell. Policymakers were concerned that the Iran war developments were contributing to a higher level of uncertainty. The statement specifically noted concern over increase in energy prices, with policymakers bracing for more inflation. On Wednesday, Trump rejected Iran's Hormuz offer, keeping the U.S. blockade in place. The historic energy shock due to the Iran war has led to higher fuel and airline prices, and that is pushing U.S. inflation back towards 4%.
Don't know what gas prices are going to do for the rest of the year. And it will depend on how long the strait remains closed and how quickly it can be reopened and that kind of thing. But remember, when gas prices go up, that's disposable income coming out of people's pockets, so they're going to spend less on other things. So there will be a hit to GDP. So it's a question whether spending goes down to offset the inflationary effects. So it's not the answer isn't obvious ex ante whether you should move your rate over because of that. We'll have to see how it evolves.
Still, the Fed indicated the current rise in price pressures as a transitory supply shock rather than a demand-driven inflation spiral. Unlike the pandemic, supply disruptions are narrower now and household real incomes are already under pressure. So that reduces the second-round inflation effect risk. But poly-market bets show that the Fed is no longer expected to cut interest rates in 2026. The odds of the Fed cutting rates this year fell to a new low of 44%. And for more updates on Fed, my colleague Susan Tarani has sent us this report from New York. Take a look.
Well, the Justice Department recently dropped its criminal probe into Fed renovation costs. Jerome Powell says that the broader political pressure from President Trump and his administration threatens the Fed's independence, and he wants to stay on as a governor. Now, Powell can stay on as a governor until 2028, making it harder for the White House to reshape the Fed quickly, even with a new chair. Meanwhile, the U.S. Central Bank announced that it will not change the country's key lending rate for a 3rd consecutive time. Susan Tahrani reporting from New York for WION World is One.